sinister pall of smoke, the world's most destructive force has been unleashed. With what results we know only too well.
Good evening, good morning, depends on which part of the planet you are in now. Welcome everyone to our online commemorative event, remembering the bombings fighting U.S. imperialist aggression. This event has been organized by the International League of People's Struggle with the help of Commission 4 or the Commission on Just Peace Against Imperialist War. We hold this timely event following the 80th anniversaries of the catastrophic U.S. nuclear bombings of Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9. 80 years ago, the U.S. dropped 2 nuclear bombs on civilian centers in an act that should be referred to as nothing less than indiscriminate state terrorism. This act killed over 200,000 people, completely destroyed the cities the bombs were dropped on, and left a crippling legacy of cancer and other radiation sickness for generations of families to live with. In addition, the U.S. production and testing of nuclear weapons would go on to poison and displace thousands of people involved in or living near uranium mining, waste dumping, and testing sites. What is the relevance of this 80th year that we remember the horrific and terroristic U.S. bombings? The only time in history that nuclear weapons were used by a state against people in a direct act of war. In remembering these events and the impacts that they had on so many people, we find much significance for today's fights for just and lasting peace against the build-up to imperialist war. The U.S. war machine is on the rampage, with over 800 overseas military bases and around 14,000 of other forms of overseas military facilities. The U.S. is by far the #1 imperialist in the world, and the profit-driven U.S. military-industrial complex remains one of the largest threats to humanity. It wages devastating proxy wars on multiple fronts around the world. It has reinforced the NATO alliance to the highest level of military spending in its history, all while continuing to fuel its proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, despite the hundreds of thousands of Russian and Ukrainian deaths with no peace deal in sight. It arms its fascist rabid dog Israel to the teeth and allows it to wage a genocidal war against the Palestinian people. In other words, of expansion against Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and even a full-on war against Iran. In the Pacific, the US has built an iron web of military alliances, missile stations, aircraft carriers, submarines around its so-called island chains to encircle China. In each of these fronts of war, nuclear weapons continue to play a key role, including US nuclear missile silos stored throughout Europe as part of its so-called nuclear umbrella. The bombing of Iran by two nuclear states, the US and Israel under the unjust and completely false pretense of claiming Iran itself was developing nuclear weapons. And the many US nuclear bombers and submarines stationed throughout the Indian Ocean and South China Sea aimed at China, and nuclear invasion exercises on the Korean Peninsula against the DPRK. And yet, we are falsely told that Russia, China, the DPRK, and even Iran are the true nuclear threats to the people. We know that this is false. For the last 80 years, the US has been the number one nuclear terrorist in the world. And the current nuclear arms race is a race between a US-led war machine that brought nuclear weapons into the world to begin with, and a number of states that the US has threatened to submit to a nuclear holocaust unless they develop the ability to defend their people and sovereignty from imperialist intervention. So 80 years ago, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were nightmarish experiments to create the supremacy of the United States. But all these years later, the threat of nuclear war is completely out of control. The chance of many nuclear weapons being deployed at one time are much higher than ever before. The imperialists are mad with power. The people are the only ones who can stop nuclear war. So we hold this webinar as part of the fight to win just and lasting peace for the entire world, a world where imperialism has been defeated. Today, we will hear from speakers who are near and dear to this fight. With their words today, we will commemorate this 88th anniversary of historic harm and unbreakable steadfastness. And we will strengthen our mass movement to fight against US imperialist aggression. Our first speaker will be Yoshio Nakamura of the Asia-wide campaign against US and Japanese domination of the Pacific. He will speak on the legacy of the US bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the people of Japan, and the state of US and Japanese imperialism in the region today. Nakamura-san, take it on.
So, hello everyone. I am Yoshio Nakamura from Asian-wide campaign Japan, and I will start my speech in Japanese. Okay. 広島、長崎の原爆投下80
On the
周年にあ
80th
たって
anniversary
私
of
た
the
ちは
atomic
改
bombings
め
of
て
Hiroshima
この
and
アメリカ帝
Nagasaki,
国主義の
we once
蛮
again
行を
condemn
断
this
罪し
barbaric act
すべての
of
被
US
爆者と
imperialism
その子孫たち
and
に対す
demand
る
justice
正
and
義と
compensation
保
for
障
all the
を求めます。
victims
of the bombings and their descendants. The US atomic bombing instantly reduced two cities to ruins. By the end of 1945, approximately 140,000 people in Hiroshima and 70,000 in Nagasaki had died. This stands as a clear example of crimes against humanity committed by US imperialism. However, the US government has never acknowledged this atrocity and continues to justify it. After the US bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities in June this year, US President Trump compared it to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He said that one strike ended the war, and I don't want to use the example of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but essentially it's the same. We strongly condemn such remarks. As stated in the ILPS statement, even without the atomic bombings, Japanese imperialism would have been defeated. The decisive factor in Japan's defeat in World War II was not the atomic bomb or the US military, but the resistance of the peoples of Asia, especially in China. Over the past 80 years, survivors of the bombings have suffered not only from injuries caused by radiation and blasts, but also from illnesses such as leukemia and cancer, and severe psychological trauma. Post-bombing hardships such as deteriorated living conditions and food shortages further worsened their lives. They also faced social discrimination. Their descendants continue to live under difficult conditions. Many of them suffer from health issues, but the Japanese government denies the genetic effects of the bombings and therefore provides insufficient support. At the same time, we must point out that the victims of the atomic bombings were not only Japanese. Among the approximately 210,000 who died, around 40,000 were Koreans. Many of them had been forcibly brought from the Korean peninsula and made to work in military factories and other forced labor sites. Chinese and other foreign civilians were also affected, along with hundreds of Allied prisoners of war who died from the bombings. That's why we demand justice and compensation not only for Japanese victims, but for all survivors and their descendants. From his historical standpoint, the US atomic bombings were the result of an anti-imperialist war between the US and Japan. It was a war between two imperialist powers vying for hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. This serves as a painful but essential lesson for the people, the absolute necessity and importance of resisting imperialist wars of aggression. We at AWC oppose all nuclear development because we understand the horrific reality when nuclear weapons are used. in March 2011, we also faced another nuclear disaster, the meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Its effects are still ongoing. Nuclear development leads to radiation exposure at every stage, from uranium mining to development to testing and manufacturing. That's why we demand the total abolition of all nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants. At the same time, as an anti-imperialist organization, we recognize that fighting against the US-led nuclear monopoly and deterrence strategy is of the utmost importance. US imperialism armed with nuclear weapons remains the greatest and most common enemy of people around the world. We must also speak about the Japanese government. Prime Minister Ishiba spoke of a world without nuclear war and a world without nuclear weapons at the peace memorial ceremonies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki this year. However, the Japanese government has still not ratified the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Under the US-Japan military alliance, the Japanese government has accepted the so-called nuclear umbrella of the US. In recent extended deterrence dialogues between US and Japanese foreign and defense officials, it was revealed that scenarios involving US nuclear strikes in the event of a Taiwan contingency were being discussed. Although Japan does not currently possess nuclear weapons, it has the technology and plutonium reserves to produce them. One reason the Japanese government continues to operate nuclear power plants despite the Fukushima disaster is to maintain its nuclear weapons development capability. Let us expand people's resistance to imperialist nuclear armament and wars of aggression. That is how we will truly honor the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki today.
Is that it? Thank you, Nakamura-san. We have heard how Nakamura-san has reminded us of the wounds of the past 80 years, the inhumane memories, the thousands who died, but not only Japanese, but people from other nations, how the bombing was not really necessary because the Japanese Imperial Army at the time was already set to surrender. And he also lamented the lack of support from Japan for the victims of the bombings. And we have heard him speak of the vision of the Japanese people when nuclear weapons are no more, when we can say goodbye to nuclear weapons, and that can only happen if the US imperialists are defeated. So in remembrance of the 80 years, Nakamura-san is inviting us to keep on organizing and taking to the streets to protest the continuing production of nuclear weapons led by the United States and its imperialist allies. Thank you again very much, Nakamura-san. So before we move on, we want to inform you that the ILPS has just recently published a primer on nuclear weapons. So it's on your screen. U.S. imperialism and the fight for just and lasting peace. So you can, this is a short booklet which expounds on the League's position on nuclear weapons and the tactics towards ending the existential threat of nuclear war by uniting against the greatest nuclear terrorist in the world, U.S. imperialism. It is currently published in English, though we will be translating it into other languages in the months to come. So it's here. You can download it on our website on the link provided here in the chat and on the screen here. So take hold of the primer. The primer details the hypocrisy of the so-called U.S. nuclear umbrella, which the U.S. Falsely claims is a guarantee for peace in the world, while it deliberately attacks other countries for developing even civilian nuclear energy program. A blatant example of this hypocrisy was in the recent U.S. and Zionist aggression against Iran that can be seen in this video recently released by ILPS. So feel free to download this primer.
Before Israel and America did what we did, Iran was within days of having a nuclear weapon. Now
Within days?
Within days.
History repeats itself first as tragedy.
I take the fact that he develops weapons of mass destruction very seriously.
Second as farce.
Our objective was a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror.
The U.S. Zionist alliance, unable to win their genocidal war against the Palestinian people in Gaza, attempted to escalate regionally by attacking Iran under the guise of trying to stop the threat of Iran obtaining nuclear weapons.
When Iran has nuclear capabilities, nuclear bomb, it's only a matter of days.
But who is the real nuclear threat to humanity? Israel, unlike Iran, has never signed on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and has never declared its nuclear arsenal, and has consistently opposed all efforts for a nuclear-free Middle East. Yet they're allowed to act outside the rules. The United States, which has ratified the NPT, has aided the Zionist entity's lawlessness by shielding its nuclear arsenal while pointing the finger at countries without a single nuclear weapon. Any calls for Iran to stop its nuclear program by the only country to ever drop a nuclear weapon as an act of war and collaborating with another on a genocide must be exposed and opposed. Join us to expose and oppose the nuclear hypocrisy of the United States and the Zionist entity and defend Iran and all states assertive of their national independence against imperialist intervention on the anniversaries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, August 6th and 9th.
So we hope you will all download the primer and use it to hold mass political education on the issue. We will be actually holding an online political discussion on the primer on September 7th. So take note of the date. We hope you will join us by registering in the link that I think we have in the chat. So it must be clear that we cannot talk about nuclear weapons without talking about the US-led military-industrial complex. So we will now hear from Carly Brook of the Global Secretariat of the Resist US-led War Movement, a global network of anti-war and peace organizations united against all forms of US-led war and fighting for just and lasting peace. Carly, you have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you to the International League of People's Struggles for inviting Resist US-led War to join the discussion today. It's an honor to be here. Resist US-led War is a global anti-war and pro-peace alliance of individuals and organizations who fight against US-led war and are struggling to build a just peace. And today we're here to confront one of the gravest threats to humanity, the imperialist nuclear weapons regime, which is, as Nakamura-san said, led by the United States imperialists. And for over 80 years, it has really been the United States that has driven the production, the proliferation, and escalation of these weapons of mass destruction, not for defense, but for domination. From the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to today's reckless modernization programs, the US is fueling a global arms race while the people around the world are suffering the consequences. I'd like to address some of the current nuclear flashpoints that reflect a broader US military strategy and its desperate attempt to remain the sole hegemonic power. And this is happening in a multipolar world where there's more than one imperialist country today competing for spheres of influence and resources. In our movement, we have analyzed three key fronts of US-led war where this plays out. The first is in Eastern Europe, where NATO's expansion and US proxy wars escalate tensions with Russia. The second is in the Middle East or West Asia, where the US, Israeli, Gulf, and Turkish alliance threatens Iran with regime change and nuclear blackmail. And third, in the Asia Pacific, where the US has woven together an iron web of military alliances like AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US, JACUS, JAFIS, and the Quad to encircle its primary rival, which is China, according to US defense strategy documents, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK. And across these three fronts and all of their ramifications in other parts of the world, the US paints its rivals as dictatorships, as terrorists, as authoritarian regimes, while the United States itself drags millions of people into conflicts that they never asked for and do not want. However, today's aggression by the United States will only fuel anti-imperialist resistance as people across these regions unite against US nuclear threats. So today, we'll expose the victims of this nuclear legacy, who profits off of it, and how growing global resistance is rising to dismantle it. So first, I'd like to address how the United States really is the main driver of nuclear proliferation in the world. Over 80 years ago, the United States didn't just create the nuclear weapons. It has consistently, over the last 8 decades, normalized their use as tools of terror. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 were really horrific, cold-blooded experiments in mass murder. The US deliberately chose these cities, who had been relatively untouched by previous bombings, to test its new weapons' destructive power on civilians. And this remains one of history's most barbaric war crimes. It's a clear demonstration of US imperialism's willingness to slaughter innocents for dominance. And since then, the US has continued to drive nuclear proliferation through arming its allies, through forcing adversaries to react, and through sabotaging treaties. And I'd like to address those three key ways. So first, arming allies through NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The US has a nuclear sharing program. The US stations bombs in Europe, for example, recently transferring more nuclear weapons to the UK. And it turns a blind eye to Israel's illegal nuclear arsenal, Another example is the US helped arm apartheid South Africa, which intended to use nuclear weapons to expand its racist and fascist settler colonialism across the continent before the regime was defeated. In forcing adversaries to react, countries like North Korea and Iran, as was mentioned, pursue nuclear capabilities because of the need to defend against US aggression, including vicious sanctions, invasions, cyber, and regime change campaigns of the United States. The US is demanding a nuclear monopoly, but threatening anyone who resists against it. And third, in sabotaging treaties, the US is the one to abandon the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and dissolving the INF, or Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. And the US has undermined the Iran deal. There's no guarantee that current arms control measures will be renewed by President Trump. So the US itself is taking down decades of arms control agreements while accusing others of provocation. Clearly, the US strategy for nuclear weapons isn't about security, it's about expanding its empire. And this is all happening while corporations are making billions off of developing further today's nuclear war machine. Behind every single nuclear warhead is a supply chain that has been drenched in blood and exploitation. Who's profiting off of this destruction is corporations like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon, who get the billions from Pentagon contracts. Right now, the US has a plan to spend $2 trillion on its modernization, which is writing a blank check to the war profiteers. This modernization includes the three legs of the triad of nuclear weapons in the United States, and every part of that system causes impacts to the people. It's impacting the uranium miners who are disproportionately indigenous and poor and face radiation poisoning and early deaths. It affects workers in bomb plants like Pantex in Texas who risk their lives assembling these weapons. It affects communities near test sites from the Marshall Islands to Algeria to Nevada, New Mexico to New Zealand who have endured cancers, poisoned water, poisoned land, and birth defects for generations. And this is all part of deliberately sacrificing communities for imperialist greed. So clearly, this expansion isn't for deterrence, it's for profit. There's a human cost, and nuclear weapons affect people from cradle to grave. So every step along the supply chain to develop a nuclear weapon, let alone to deal with dismantling them, will cost people. This is where the mining clears the way for exploiting often indigenous land for uranium. The testing leaves entire communities devastated and exposed to health impacts. For example, in the Marshall Islands, the United States detonated 67 nuclear bombs, 67 nuclear bombs in the Pacific alone, and deliberately conducted human medical experiments on the population where people have been experiencing health impacts for years. In Iraq, for example, generations still suffer from uranium-tipped weapons. And even the veterans who were responsible for the cleanup of these nuclear sites the quote unquote cleanup, it was really a cover up, were sent to decontaminate test sites without protective gear, without information about what they were getting into. And they themselves have also been abandoned with illnesses. And today, the United States continues to hold the world hostage with the threat of a nuclear detonation that would kill millions of people, trigger a nuclear winter or a global famine, and condemn survivors to slow radiation deaths. But the US is still building and expanding its arsenal instead of dismantling it. And as the United States produces new nuclear warheads today, like the B6112, the W87-1, these are new nuclear weapons designed for a usable nuclear war. So the United States is threatening to combine its conventional and nuclear warfare with smaller or smarter bombs to make nuclear war seem winnable. And we know that no one will win in a nuclear war. But these so-called tactical nuclear weapons are deployed, for example, 17 miles from where I live at Kitsap Bangor Naval Base. And this base holds the largest deployed concentration of nuclear weapons, including these tactical nukes based on submarines. The US is also expanding its ICBM program, its Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Program, with $100 billion for new land-based missiles called Sentinels, and also planes that could drop nuclear bombs and submarines. Um, all the while, the US refuses to adopt a no first use policy, reserving the right to nuke anyone at any time. So this isn't defense. This isn't deterrence. It's a policy of annihilation. Um, and meanwhile, the corporations spend millions lobbying Congress for new contracts. Um, we could talk about Lockheed Martin's new Trident nuclear missiles, the F-35s. We can talk about the Sentinel ICBM program from Northrop Grumman, which will rake in $39 billion in revenue. We could talk about new warhead guidance systems raking in $74 billion in revenue to Raytheon. So while our people are starving, while there are forced famines in Palestine and Sudan, while the education systems for our youth are crumbling, and in many places our social services are denied to the majority of people, and while the climate crisis is escalating, these corporations are lobbying for endless war because they don't care about peace. They care about stock prices. But there's always been a people's resistance against this nuclear weapons regime. The mass anti-nuclear movement of the 1980s, which emerged during the Cold War, was a powerful show of force that the people don't want the nuclear threat of the United States anymore. But the 1980s did not dismantle this threat. And today we need to continue to revitalize it, but link it strongly with global liberation movements against US-led war, all forms of US-led war, and not fight against nuclear weapons in isolation. Today's struggle has to be anti-imperialist, from Kenya's Gen Z protests to the People's Wars in the Philippines, from the Palestinian resistance to this global rising solidarity movement demanding a free Palestine from the river to the sea. We must link our struggles against nuclear weapons to the need for a true people's liberation that can dismantle US imperialism. There's been so many inspiring and courageous actions taken over the decades. It's also been 80 years of people's resistance from confronting the profiteers, the financiers, disrupting the bases. There have been blockades, there have been occupations against nuclear labs. People have targeted the manufacturers. People have demanded divestment from institutions invested in nuclear production. And even the United Nations has a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which the US boycotts and refuses to sign on to. That makes nuclear weapons illegal internationally as it has entered into force. So wherever we are, we wage mass struggles to end the imperialist war machine and redirect the billions of dollars invested in the danger and death of this war machine. So to honor the Hiroshima survivors, to the Navajo uranium miners, to honor the Marshallese activists, and to continue to stand with the people's resistance. There must always be a people struggle against the military terror of the United States. So we say no to nuclear terror, no to US imperialism. Another world is possible without nuclear weapons, and we will continue to fight for it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Carly, for that very incisive analysis on the role of the United States in the production, in the proliferation and escalation of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. And also the U.S. Complicity with the military nuclear industrial complex, or what you call the profiteers of this industry. Carly has pointed out that the U.S. is the primary driver in at least three key fronts for its war of aggression in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, and in Asia Pacific. She also said that nuclear weapons are indeed a lifelong curse from the cradle to the grave. Radioactive waste, babies born with deformities, the enormous deaths and destructions. But we are optimist people are now fighting back. So this challenge which ILPS challenge to have the global solidarity movement against US-led wars and proliferation of nuclear weapons. I think we can have a copy of this very informative presentation presented to us by Carly of Resist US-led war movement. Thank you very much. And as we have heard today, and also just saw in the recent video, people have been organizing and taking to the streets for 80s to demand justice for those killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The survivors and generations of people have been lived with the genetic defects and sicknesses of radiation poisoning, and all those killed, sickened, and displaced along the supply chain and testing grounds of nuclear weapons. So we must continue to demand justice and end the US-led war now. Our final speaker will be Len Cooper, the chairperson of the International League of People's Struggle. Len will read the official statement of ILPS published for the 80th anniversary of the US bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Len, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan, and it's an honor to be involved in this online discussion with you all. on this important topic. I've been requested to read the statement by the International League of People's Struggles about the 80th anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing of Japan. We have entitled that statement, 80 Years is Enough, Resist US Imperialist Wars of Aggression and Nuclear Bullying. I'd like to begin our statement with a quote, and I read that quote now. The quote is, "Now I become death, the destroyer of worlds." These were the words of J. Robert Oppenheimer, leader of the US commissioned Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb after its first detonation in Los Alamos, New Mexico on July the 16th, 1945. On August the 6th, 1945, just a few weeks later, the United States incinerated Hiroshima by that nuclear weapon, and 3 days after, Nagasaki, killing over 200,000 people, completely destroying the two cities and leaving a crippling legacy of death and devastation. On the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the barbaric bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the US, the International League of People's Struggles joins the Japanese people and all peace-loving peoples in commemorating the event and in condemning the continuing nuclear proliferation threat from the US and its imperialist allies. Not content, immediately after the World War II, the United States sought out the Marshall Islands in the South Pacific as a location to test and develop its newly proven and developed nuclear arsenal. After developing their own, testing was also done later by the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and the US itself in the French Polynesia, Kiribati, Johnson Atoll, in Australia, Algeria, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Russia's Novaja Zemlya, and other places, decimating indigenous communities, including entire nations in the Pacific, with far-reaching effects on human health, ecology, and global security, including radiation exposure, environmental destruction, and long-term health consequences. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki 80 years ago was an exercise of unnecessary and excessive force. Historical evidence is clear that Japan would have surrendered soon anyway, even if the atom bombs had not been dropped, and as later admitted by many US civilian and military top brass themselves, including then Generals Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, Curtis LeMay, and George Marshall, and Admiral William Lee. The real objectives of the US in bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki was to demonstrate US military superiority as the unrivaled post-war superpower, using its newest tool, nuclear weapons. The US has constantly tried to intimidate and blackmail the whole world into submission using nuclear armaments. But the USSR frustrated the US design and ended the monopoly of these weapons of mass destruction in 1949 and deterred the US from further using its atomic bombs. As of 2025, 9 countries are known to possess nuclear weapons: the United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, China, Israel, although they've never formally acknowledged their weapons, India, Pakistan, and North Korea, with a total of approximately 12,331 nuclear warheads globally, with the US and Russia holding more than 90%, 95%. Excuse me. Despite many multilateral treaties passed to try and stop the growth of nuclear weapons, such as the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty, the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the 1996 Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, multiple versions of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START, and the 2021 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the US has either not signed, has found loopholes around, or simply ignored these and continued aggression and provocative threats of nuclear readiness against its rivals. The US has also threatened its rival countries that were suspected, sometimes baselessly accused, of developing nuclear weapons, such as Libya, Iraq, Iran, and others. Recently, in using the nuclear talks as a pretext, the US and Israel attacked Iran, presumably because Iran is the strongest opponent to the genocidal expansionism of the Zionist entity, and because it's the main roadblock in the way of full, less US-led domination over West Asia. The US has no qualms in using double standards to prevent Iran from developing its nuclear program, but not others like Israel, as long as they do not stand against its imperialist will. Calls against the dangers of any new state obtaining nuclear weapon ring hollow if the calls are not directed principally against the US-led nuclear arsenal. As long as the US holds onto its nuclear arsenal, it is justified for other states to hold onto theirs. Thus, instead of calling for the abolition of all nuclear weapons now, we instead call for the US to be disarmed of its nuclear weapons so that the historic nuclear threat it has posed to the world's people and many states is no longer the leading factor of the nuclear arms race. The League calls on the people to build broad alliances and wage militant struggle to end US imperialism, the number one nuclear terrorist in the world, as a step towards ending the imperialist system as a whole, and therefore the logic that gives rise to the existential threat to humanity that nuclear weapons clearly are. There can only be genuine, just, and lasting peace in the world if the imperialist system and structure that builds wars and weapons of mass destruction is exposed and destroyed. This can be done by building a broad, international, and anti-imperialist united front that respects the rights of nations and peoples to self-determination. Remembering Hiroshima and Nagasaki and honouring the thousands of innocent lives lost, the surviving victims with their long-term suffering and their fading memories as silent witnesses to the horror of nuclear bombs under imperialist aggression, the ILPS calls on the world's people to intensify their struggle against US imperialism and its barbaric and terrorist policy of producing, maintaining, using, and threatening to use nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. 80 years is enough. Thank you on behalf of the International League of People's Struggles.
Thank you, Len. Indeed, 80 years is enough. Enough for the production and proliferation of nuclear weapons, which the US has driven not for defense or deterrence, but for its imperialist domination of the world. Enough for the US fueling a global arms race while communities around the world are suffering the consequences. Enough for corporations like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon, which are raking in billions from Pentagon contracts for the so-called nuclear modernization. 80 years is enough. Resist US imperialist wars of aggression and nuclear bombing. Thank you again, Len. And as we close, may we remind you that you tune in again on September 7 for our open educational discussion on our primer, nuclear weapons, U.S. imperialism, and the fight for a just and lasting peace. Please register as indicated in the chat. Thank you. And we say no to nuclear terror, no to U.S. imperialism. Another world is possible, and we will fight for it. Thank you all for joining us. Good night. Good morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Long live international solidarity.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
See you next time.
Thank you, everyone.